I end up conventionally saying in introducing people that you've never heard of before, it's a great pleasure to introduce someone as a kind of rhetorical fiction. But this evening, it really is different. I'm having a great deal of pleasure in introducing Gordana Korolija's first lecture, public lecture at the AA, which I'm sure will be the first of many. What she's going to talk about is drawn from her doctoral thesis on the rhetoric of the surface, a thesis which went through various vicissitudes, starting as it did in the 80s at a certain high point of interest in Derrida, and part of the thesis was an investigation whether his text on letters provided some kind of new route into thinking about Alberti. As the 80s wore into the 90s, and as some of the initial hopes about an Derridian reading were, if not abandoned, then certainly modified, what came to the fore in the thesis was an extremely interesting rereading of Alberti's Della Pittura. And it's some of the materials from that which Godanna is going to present this evening. I think it's a very significant rereading of Alberti, and if really developed and if applied to a current literature, not just on the question of perspective, but on the question of the relationship between perspective and architecture, the argument will, I'm sure, have a very real critical import. So it's a pleasure for us, in a way, this evening to hear the initial statement of the argument before it becomes developed in respect to other fields. Now, as I'm sure many people sitting here know, Godanna teaches and bears the brunt of the teaching in the history and theory program in the graduate school, and has done so for a number of years. I think her lectures on architectural theory are amongst one of the sort of best kept secrets of architectural theory, compared to the extremely sort of extravagant claims that many other people kind of make in such lectures. Hers, I think, are marked by an extremely careful consideration of the arguments which have been put forward in the last 20 years. And I think that course is a model of its kind. She actually studied in the history and theory program before starting to teach on it and to do her PhD. And before that, did her architectural training in Belgrade. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Godanna this evening.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. So, where shall I start? Perhaps I should start by outlining something in relation to the people who, in a way, were quite instrumental and helpful for me in my work, as this occasion seems to be calling for it. I would first of all like to thank to my supervisors who had supported me in my thesis. I would like to thank Mark Cousins, Paul Hurst, and my advisor John Anance. Also, I would like to thank a present and past chairman who sort of supported my work. Also, I would like to thank Ranieri Fontana Giuspi, who helped me translate a previously unknown piece by Leon Battista Alberti called De Commodis Literarum and Atque Incommodis. And last but not least, I would like to thank history and theory students who provided the environment for this work to happen. What I would like to discuss today, I have entitled The Cutting Surface. As you might have seen from the outline in the events list, it will concentrate on the arguments about the perspective. But in its subtitle, I have also put that it will discuss painting as the section, its relationship to writing, and its role in understanding space. I have chosen to discuss the subject of perspective today, and some of you might be mused, why talking about it again? There is a general belief around that we have mastered perspective, that we know how it works, that we know its secrets, and that the 20th century artists have managed to unfold it. And some of the theorists have followed it, apparently. However, if one looks more closely at this highly speculative matter, which is taken as a common sense itself, there are indeed surprisingly very few studies which engaged with either relevant philosophical or indeed architectural questions. In different texts, perspective is approached with a lot of dogmatism, prejudices, and indeed sometimes quite often precipitate conclusions which do not help, as it were, the knowledge of perspective. Such is the captivating and heuristic power of perspective that the value of it as a model for thought continues to exercise its influence over the wide range of domains. These issues have been pointed out, indeed, in a book by Damisch on perspective, which came out in 1987, in French edition, 1994 English. And this book provides, as it were, a response in a field of cultural studies about what is perspective and what perspective has been doing. Now, we could perhaps at the beginning, at the very introduction, mention people like Michel Foucault or Jacques Lacan, and say that while Michel Foucault in Las Meninas has indicated the workings of the system of representation as a basis for thought in the classical age, and Jacques Lacan approached painting as the relation through which the subject comes to find its bearings as such, both of these attempts are, as Damisch has argued, and in a way I would sort of agree with that, some more of an opening. They present an opening, and they indeed suggest a kind of a preliminary character for much work which needs to be done. So in that sense, I'm outlining all this to suggest to the prospective students not to be shy, and that there is indeed a sense of more work to be done. Particularly having in mind that far from being exposed in the 20th century, in the 20th century art, perspective is alive and circulating, I would say, more than ever. What I have in mind is that the photographic box and the camera, which is indeed its technical extension, film, video recordings, and more recently, computer-generated images, disseminate spontaneously and, so to speak, mechanically a particular kind of ideology. It is easy for some to maintain that technical procedures in itself are neutral, and that ideology, if there is any, should be looked at in the message and not in the procedure. This question, however, when applied to the examination of the so-called scientific perspective, that is to say, perspectiva artificialis, as formulated by Alberti, will show us that the only scientific thing about it might be its title. So, I should therefore argue about a 15th century formulation of the category of painting as one of the liberal arts by examining Leon Battista Alberti's seminal text, De Pictura. But the approach taken in this analysis of De Pictura is not simply to acknowledge it as a humanist book and then attempt to demonstrate this, as indeed Michael Bexenthal did it in his brilliant essay. The aim is to conduct an architecturally relevant, as it were, forensic examination of it. So it's architecturally relevant forensic examination of it. In choosing to write about painting, I would argue, Alberti answers his own demand made earlier, which called for writing about new things. He identified contemporary phenomena at the time that he found important. By selecting the practice of painting, Alberti takes on the challenge of writing about it for the first time. It is difficult to estimate for us nowadays the extent to which this act, the act of writing about the painting for the first time, was both a breakthrough and a risk. The treatise on painting could be submitted to the following question, and indeed following questions. What is this painting in front of Alberti that he talks about? What is its nature, and how does it inscribe itself? And indeed, why is it still relevant for us today in a context of discussion of perspective in particular? Okay, well, I'll start by outlining some of the so-called historical facts, or rather, I'll sort of refer to a well-known myth. I call it a myth because indeed the whole episode between Brunelleschi and Alberti, as treated by architectural history and art history, has acquired somewhat mythic status. But it seems to be, as it were, quite inevitable to sort of refer to it, and really more for the purposes of dismantling this, what I called a Socrato-Platonic myth, in which Brunelleschi and Alberti take the places respectively. Okay, so I would like some slides just to accompany this kind of art historical kind of feeling. So, right. I think the one on the left needs a bit of focusing. Do I have it here? Okay. So, the myth goes, when Alberti returned to Florence as papal secretary in 1434, he was introduced to the works of art in his family's native city. His writings became related to the work of Brunelleschi, the busiest Florentine architect at the time, and the circle of the artists whom he writes with so much admiration, He writes about them in the dedication for the Italian version of De Pictura, which is, of course, a dedication to Brunelleschi. In 1435, Alberti finished his Latin version of the treatise on painting, which primarily aimed to reconstruct Masaccio's, the painting on the left, execution of the Trinity painting in Santa Maria Novella, as the composition and its proportions were highly esteemed at the time. As you could see, Masaccio has achieved this through careful construction of the geometry of the vault and the measurable spatial units inside, that in a way go inside the projected vault. According to Vasari, Masaccio learned most of his skills of spatial representation from Brunelleschi and his renowned panels. However, it was apparently Alberti's choice and self-imposed task to describe the processes which had governed the practice of painting at the time. In order to clarify, and I'm just going to go forward with some of the pictures. You have here a nice painting by Vasari, which shows most of the painters. Starting with Giotto, you have then Paolo Uccello, Donatello, and then you have Manetti, who is this biographer that I keep on referring to, and the last one is Brunelleschi. So in order to clarify Brunelleschi's position in relation to Alberti, Manetti's description of the famous experiment needs to be considered, since all subsequent interpretations refer to it. Manetti argued that Alberti's description of the scheme in De Pictura derived out of Brunelleschi's exercises with panels, but this description lacks clarity, indeed in many ways. According to Manetti, the first of the Brunelleschi's panels depicted the Florentine baptistry and the Piazza del Duomo, as seen from inside the doorway of the Duomo. I'm showing you some of the plans which say that. Okay, I have the. Here it's marked. Okay. This is the Duomo, this is the baptistry, this is the viewing point. Here it's sort of tilted, but basically this is the baptistry and the Duomo and the viewing point. I'm sure you know it. At the center of the inside of and I'm sort of paraphrasing here Manetti, and I'm also paraphrasing to, in a way, suggest to you the obscurity of this description. This, what you see here, are plans which were drawn by different interpreters much later. This is by John White. But I'm paraphrasing Manetti and the obscurity of his report, because, in a way, Alberti himself has never kind of drawn anything, and we have only his words for it, which I would refer to later. So, according to Manetti, the first of Brunelleschi panels depicted the Florentine baptistry and the Piazza del Duomo, as seen from the inside of the doorway. At the center of the inside of the baptistry was a panel with a hole which opened up into a pass in the shape of a woman's straw hat on the back of the panel. The viewer stood behind the panel and looked through the pass at a mirror held at arm's length in front of it. The mirror reflected the painting, and the results, according to Manetti, were fascinating. A powerful abstraction had been achieved, where the viewer was compelled to see only what he was made to see, with the usual vision cut by means of the eye hole and the shaped pass. The viewer saw only the painting as reflected in the mirror. Now, this kind of what I call obscure presentation of what happened is the only evidence what we have about Brunelleschi's experiments. What we have from then onwards are a series of plans, as I've shown here, or indeed some reconstructions, which I show here. The picture on the left shows the reconstructions done by Eugenio Battisti in his book 4 on Brunelleschi, and we see how the panels work. We see here the person standing in front of the Duomo, and we see how, in a way, this is the mirror, this is the picture of the baptistry, and the person has a hole here, watches through the hole, sees the mirror. So in a way, the baptistry in front of him, that's this, okay, and this is what he sees. The rendered bits are in his visual field. So almost all studies of the 15th century art state that this practical demonstration by Brunelleschi was theorized by Alberti. Indeed, Alberti's good fortune, I would argue, was that he could have been instructed by architect himself, that is to say Brunelleschi, so he didn't have to rely upon Manetti's ambiguous report. There are difficulties in reading Manetti's description of Brunelleschi's experiments as a pretext for Alberti's theory of perspective. There is also a significant, I would argue, distinction between Brunelleschi and Alberti's approaches, which cannot be bridged solely by claiming the obscurity of the sources. Scholarship generally interprets the guidelines for Brunelleschi's practical demonstration and Alberti's painterly perspective as derived from the principles of then traditional theory of optics. To sort of just mention briefly what that included, that included the relevant sources on optics, and it is possible to single out the notions in that sense picked up from this body of knowledge of optics. If I'm just sort of put two major works, I would sort of have to put certainly the work of Euclid and the other by Ptolemy. These ancient sources were interpreted by a series of medieval interpreters, including Vitello, Roger Bacon, and and John Peckham. So these are the sources that Alberti picks up and Brunelleschi apparently pick up and work with. Now, that sort of brings us somehow closer to the issue, but what still kind of remains quite distinct is that there is still a kind of discontinuity between what Alberti says and what Brunelleschi does. And this is what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that in a way we have not a transposition, that in Alberti's work we have not the transposition of Brunelleschi's experiment into words, but rather a whole different separate exercise. What I'm arguing is that Brunelleschi, as the architect, has done something which was, in a way, an architectural exercise, a spatial exercise at the time, which included making this kind of experiments. Him being a builder, at the time being involved in projects like that, which involved, first of all, a kind of knowledge of great kind of spatial complexities. This is the interior of the dome, and we know that he was involved at the time in building it, and we know also that the dome and the making of it is still considered as one of the kind of unexplained bits. We know that there is still a big debate among the historians and scholars whether it was built with centering or not. We know that the kind of actual working of the brickwork is still a kind of mystery. So in a way, what I'm pointing out is that in Brunelleschi we have somebody who is involved in the world of making spatial structures, construction of this kind, and so on. Something which these are instruments that he would use on the sites and that he would in fact draw, construct, suggest for pushing and pulling stuff on the heights, which were at the time quite huge. So you can imagine, without kind of anything of what we have today, what kind of knowledge about the weights, mechanics, spatial structures was involved to sort of do it. Now, he was, in a way, opposed in many respects, if sort of out of the world of learning to which Alberti belonged as a man of letters. And indeed, that's why he insisted on reading the Pictura only in Italian rather than in Latin. And this is why it was kind of translated. The man of letters, which was Alberti, would be sort of living in a completely separate world, and the picture on the right suggests what that world would consist of libraries of that kind, where manuscript would be sort of shelved in a manner shown on the picture on the right. On the left we have an image of more like late 15th century architectural practice, for what we can say here, that the work consisted primarily on working with models. So what I'm outlining is this difference between the two. And I'm just, before going further, I'm just going to sort of say that in a way that difference in a way marks the difference in their subsequent interpretations. I'm saying that Brunelleschi's experiment was one thing, and Alberti's explanation in the Pictura was the other. But in order to prove that, I will have to refer to Alberti's treatise on painting. In it, Alberti describes how to begin a painting. Upon the surface, he says, the painter first draws a rectangle which serves as a frame through which to view the story he will paint, as through an open window. Then he establishes the size of a human figure and the proportional third of a body, a unit of 2 feet. Having done that, the central vanishing point is marked. Alberti then discriminates between different rays and elaborates the visual pyramid, which plays a central role in his doctrine. He then fixes the distances to the beholder's eye and makes a rule of it. So this, what he's doing, and here I'm showing a manuscript which is a manuscript that exists, which in a way can't definitely be attributed to Alberti, but is the manuscript that circulated in the 15th and 16th century, and that we have, and that picks up some of these explanations by Alberti. We don't have any drawings by Alberti that might sort of instruct us. So this is what we have. These drawings are charted here are based on this kind of explanation that Alberti gives. What I want to point out to your attention is this visual pyramid that he introduces. And indeed, we could say that that is something that he could have picked up from medieval opticians, primarily Vitello, as he was sort of referring to a visual pyramid being, as it were, the number of rays that in a way go from the eye onto the object and sort of form the pyramid as such. But let's see what sort of happens with it afterwards. So what I said is that he establishes the pyramid and that he fixes the distance of the object to the beholder's eye. He also fixes the position of the beholder, which is something new. And I won't now dwell on it. I will sort of mention it again, what happens as a consequence. But what is important, that these things from then onwards enter into the discourse on painting, and these things from then onwards happen to be fixed. The vanishing point, the distance to the object, and indeed the angle. Now, I will sort of carry on. One way of considering the 15th century struggle to represent space accurately can be found in the contradiction existing between the Euclidist perspectiva naturalis, or communis, which aims to formulate mathematically the laws of natural vision, and the perspectiva artificialis, as developed by Alberti, to provide, which is in a way aiming to provide a serviceable method for constructing images. So Euclidus is supposed to be based on formulation of mathematical laws, whilst Alberti is providing serviceable methods. Now, serviceable methods of projection of three-dimensional images on two-dimensional surfaces. This contradiction, according to the laws of geometry, can be resolved only by abandoning the so-called angle axiom, which existed at the Euclidean geometry. And indeed, as argued by Erwin Panofsky in his perspective as a symbolic form, which is perhaps still one of the most valuable accounts of perspective, as Panofsky argues, to recognize the axiom, the angle axiom, is to expose the representation to an impossible demand, that is to say, to unroll the sphere of vision onto a flat surface. Okay? What I'm saying is Euclidean geometry was operating within the scheme where, as it were, there existed such thing as an angle, which had to be sort of put into the account of any kind of vision, and that angle was not necessarily always fixed. And that angle was determining the spherical vision that in the 15th century was almost a problem, because we now wanted to sort of have something which in a way is projecting, as it were, spherically on our eye, on a spherical plane. We wanted somehow to have it flat. The optics of antiquity conceived of a field of vision as a sphere and maintained that apparent magnitudes, that is to say projections of the object onto the spherical field of vision, were determined not by the distances of the object to the eye, but solely by the width of the angle of vision. Euclid's eighth theorem states this point precisely. It is highly revealing that in the 15th century, and indeed 16th century, and in these translations of Euclidus, the eighth theory is often either completely abandoned or changed. Alberti's innovation, which added clarity, I will come back to this argument again, but what I want to say is that Alberti's innovation, and I'm going back to his scheme as described here, which, as it's usually kind of assumed, added clarity to Brunelleschi's experiment, consists in cutting, and this is what I'm suggesting his work is about, consists in cutting the visual pyramid with an intersecting plane. And indeed, he never illustrates that, okay? The person who illustrated that the best for us is indeed Dürer. and on the top we see Vignola. Okay, what we see here is on the right various interpretation of Alberti's rectangle and how the shortening is handled, and on the left I'm showing you the images of Dürer in these two cases at the lower part, in which he shows, as it were, how the intersecting veil works, intersecting veil introduced by Alberti. And what I'm saying here is this is, as it were, the first illustration that we have of what Alberti actually proposes. And what I'm also saying, this is different from what Brunelleschi has done. So let's see how this is explained in the actual text. The event of intersecting, okay, the moment of intersecting of the visual pyramid, which in a way Alberti was telling us is something that a beholder has, is explained in the comedies, in the pictura as following, and I quote: "But as it is a single surface, whether canvas or wall, upon which the painter endeavors to represent a number of various surfaces and pyramids, all included in one single pyramid, it will be necessary that this visual pyramid should be cut off in some one part, that the painter may in this part express with his lines and tints the circumferences and the colors which this intercision gives him. Thus the person who views the painted surface beholds a certain intercision of the cutting pyramid." Okay, so this is translation by Grayson. What in a way he suggests in order to be able to sort of somehow pick up everything that comes to the eye in a manner of vision, what we are going to do, and we can see it here on the lower picture by Dürer, we see the painter outlining the disegno. What he is doing, he is actually cutting his own very vision by this intersecting velo, on which, as indicated in the upper picture, the outline of the object would emerge. Now, Erwin Panofsky, in discussing how and why the possibility of this, what he praises and applauds to, of this systematic and linear perspective was not discovered in antiquity, argued that this was because of their fundamentally, and this is a quote, because of ancients' fundamentally unmodern view of space. Okay, Panofsky was asking a question: how come that ancients, because he was looking at some of the examples of the Pompeian painting, which I'm going to show you in a moment, have failed to somehow master, as it were, the perspective by sort of mastering, as it were, the way how to sort of make it into a universal method. How come that we have all these lovely constructions in Pompeii and that they somehow don't match up to sort of construct a scientifically perfect perspective? What he has in mind are paintings like this, which in a way we could see, and these are Panofsky's examples, later I will show you some of mine, which we can see how, as it were, the lines, the parallel lines don't all go into the same vanishing points. We could see that this obviously kind of does not stand out as a correct, according to the kind of Albertian perspective, this, and this would sort of have difficulties of coming together, even if these two might. Certainly in this painting and this kind of perspectival representation, we have a kind of a separate, we would see, these vanishing points might be sort of coming together, but what we have is a kind of a series of separate viewing points, which certainly this one belongs to, and that those ones sort of belong to a different system. I'm also going to show you a bit more of these things that in a way could be noted in Pompeian paintings, which in a way are very close to what we might call perspective, but they are just kind of missing, according to Panofsky, the point. And you could see how in a way both here some of the foreshortening is not quite amounting, like if you would look at something like this, or indeed the foreshortening here is not quite clear. Where would it meet? So Panofsky asked, I will repeat, why did the ancients fail to take this apparently small step of intersecting the visual pyramid, okay, the one that I've showed earlier in Dürer explanation that Alberti suggested, the small step of intersecting the visual pyramid with the plane, and thus proceed to a truly exact and systematic construction of space? That's Panofsky's question. Now, his answer is the following. He gives answer that conception of space in antiquity, which was seeking expression in the plastic arts, simply did not demand a systematic space. While this might appear as an adequate answer, though I see it only a partial response to a very good question, we could sort of try to see what could be argued in addition. And indeed, I would argue, why is it, and I would ask the question, why is it that the ancients fell short, really, to make this, what Panofsky calls a small step, Alberti had made with his intersection? Is it really such a small step? Or is it perhaps something much bigger? And indeed, contrary to Panofsky, I would argue, and I do believe, that it is truly a significant move. In my opinion, it is difficult to justify the argument that the idea of intersecting vision, okay, the visual pyramid, at any point would be a small or a logical step to make. One can even find this as unusual, strange, and even bizarre. Why cutting? There is in no other kind of optical work, ancient, medieval, there is never suggestion that the visual pyramid should be cut. There is nothing that comes between the viewer and the object. What is studied is what happens to the viewer in relation to the object. And indeed, nobody has ever proposed that something should be put in between to sort of describe the relationship. The relationship was to be theorized, looked at, and conceptualized, but it was never thought of something that should have something to cut it, that should have something to sort of be put between the viewer and the object. So why cutting is my question. And why with this, what he calls intersecting veil? Why with this intersecting surface of the veil? There was indeed no similar contemporary practice which would sort of immediately call for it. Or was there? Now, let's see how I would like to sort of outline some of the answers to these questions. While Panofsky was right when he suggested the significance of plastic arts, this three-dimensional emphasis which he suggests, and concern for the plasticity of the object, for the three-dimensional kind of understanding of the object, should not be read solely, as it were, in relation to the art object, but in a way it should be related as something that must have affected the general perception. Following Panofsky, we could argue that in antiquity, on an epistemological level, events were happening not in a two-dimensional static space of a painting, but rather in something more equivocal, something which cannot easily be represented, as indeed Euclid's geometry tells us. There is no logical reason to expect the planar intersection of vision in antiquity. Intersection, planar intersection, the intersecting veil in antiquity does not exist. More precisely, from the point of view of antiquity, this mysterious plane that Alberti introduces as an element of vision would be entirely unexpected. The apparent naturalness of this sectional plane needs to be questioned, indeed. For the ancients and their established spherical spatial system, which corresponded to then scientifically constituted realm of vision, the notion of an intersecting plane would have been mentally and geometrically alien. So, the solution proposed here in this argument to this question of intersecting, as you kind of sense already, while acknowledging Panofsky's way of sort of posing the question, is sort of also departing from it and suggesting something else. Okay, the solution which I would like to suggest for the emergence of this mysterious intersecting plane that cuts visual pyramid, that cuts our vision, or that cut Alberti's vision, is, in my mind, connected to the Alberti's practice of letters and their effects, to his practice of being a man of letters, to his practice of being a scholar, to his practice of living the life in libraries and living a life with manuscripts and books. And here comes the argument which I sort of refer to as the argument of transparency. So, for this purpose, this is now sort of bringing, as it were, the rationale. Why did I say that he introduces this veil as a consequence of him being a man of letters? In a way, to sort of make this argument, I actually have to bring into discussion the other text by Alberti, which is this, which I referred to at the very beginning, called De Commodis Literarum Atque Incommodis, which means on conveniences and inconveniences of letters, which is an early piece by Alberti, written at a very early stage of his life, something that in a way hasn't drawn up attention of scholars, hasn't been translated in English and other contemporary languages. It exists only in Latin and Italian. What is interesting about that one is the status of this text, and this is where, in a way, some of the bits that Mark has mentioned in the introduction about Derrida become quite relevant. This text, in a way, in my argument, has this kind of particular status when it is one of these texts about the text. It is a text which is like having this mise en abîme status, that is to say, reflecting upon its very status endlessly. It is a writing about writing, and indeed in this text, Alberti is sort of making some decisions about writing. So, in a way, without sort of going much into that, I'm just going to outline the part which is relevant for it. And for that purpose, I'm going to refer to one paragraph from De Commodis, which in a way, in my mind, sort of is quite revealing. It addresses the moment when Alberti expresses his concern for the status of letters, writings, scholars, disciplines, arts, society of the time in general. Okay, he writes, well, this explanation for these two slides would come later. And I quote, "It appears as completely obvious to illustrious intellects that it is more convenient and beautiful to apply for any other office than to letters." He laments about the kind of poor position of letters. "Who does not therefore see how citizens contemn letters? Who does not recognize the reason for which the decorum and the honor of letters have disappeared? Who does not have," and this is important for us, "who does not have in front of his eyes, as in a painting, ante oculus veluti pictam, the ruins and the destruction of the disciplines and of the fine arts? Who has not lamented that such a loss, such a shipwreck, naufragium, has happened because of letters?" This is the tone of this kind of almost kind of pathetic kind of lament of the status of scholars and letters and so on and so forth. But what caught my attention is this, ante oculus veluti pictam. So in this statement, we can read several points. First, Alberti's tragic view on writing that has led to the loss of arts and disciplines. Second, in this comparison, the current status of letters corresponds to a shipwreck, while destruction of the arts occurs as a ruin. And third, most interesting for this argument today, is what I call the confession of transparency, which suggests that Alberti had a painting as a model for his understanding. Ante oculus velati pictum. Painting as a model for his understanding. Something is clear, as in a painting. In this painting, Alberti sees the destruction, shipwreck of letters that led to the destruction of the great arts. He wishes for the letters and arts to be restored from this wreckage, and this remains central in his future treatises. It will subsequently appear that the restoration of both letters and arts will bring them back together. Here Alberti already envisages that the manner in which the forthcoming rescue for the arts was to involve the mutual dependency and shared life of the arts and letters. Furthermore, it is not entirely accidental that he reserves the metaphor of the ruin and of the shipwreck for the arts and letters respectively. It is as if he knows that the restored arts ought to be like a good building, not a ruin, while the letters need to glide like a ship in order to reach their destination. So I'm sort of kind of being a bit kind of departing slightly in the tone from the argument on a painting, but I think it's really necessary to bring this moment, what I call the moment of transparency, which is so well kind of presented in this mise en abîme piece on writing, through this kind of identification of knowing, which happens in this moment of seeing something clear in a painting. As in a painting. Just to say, this was written in 1429, okay, so it would be before any of the major treatises. It was before the treatise of painting, which came in 1435. It was certainly much before the treatise of architecture, which is to come in 1452. So, however, what I'm saying is that in a way something, okay, which will from then onwards sort of be very relevant for Alberti, and indeed for the whole kind of so-called culture of the Renaissance, because it was him who first writes about painting. Leonardo, Piero della Francesca, all the others actually pick up from his. Piero della Francesca picks up intersection directly from Alberti and works on a kind of proportions system in his De Pintura Pingendi. Leonardo sort of works further the whole thing about this intersection and sort of tries to sort of develop it. Uccello and other practitioners, Raphael and the others, treat it always as a basis for any kind of construction of painting. And here I'm sort of outlining, as it were, something that happened, so as it were, simply in letters, something that happens in his kind of contemplation of letters, and something that happened in writing, which I claim is affecting and is going to affect him, is going to make him produce della pittura. As we see, he wants to write about it. But also, it is going to be, on another level, on a kind of phenomenological level, which is the level of a discussion when I discuss, as it were, the visual pyramid, which will actually produce the very surface, the very cutting surface that he sort of mentions in a paragraph I quoted earlier. So, for the purposes of our argument, we could say that the moment described in the paragraph on transparency, quoted above, characterizes the new relationship between the text, image, and the building, or be it a ruin. We can see how they intersect, cross, and reflect each other. The force behind this single paragraph left its mark in most of Alberti's work. The argument here attempts to register, as it were, its implication solely for De Pictura. And there is also a possibility to discuss that in relation to De Re Edificatoria. The page and the category of writing are not considered, in my argument here, in abstract, but rather as specifically organized spatial setups. I'm just sort of going to put some other slides forward. This is Alberti on the right, man of letters, portrayed with a book. It's another kind of portrayal of Dante at the 15th century version. On the left, we have something that could be identified as Alberti's manuscript, which is a letter to Matteo di Pasti, and the others are various manuscripts of the Pictura, which we can't positively always identify were his. Okay, so the page and the category of writing are not considered, as I said, in abstract in my argument, but rather, and I remind you of this kind of forensic evidence that I promised at the beginning when I said I will approach the matter architecturally and I will sort of examine what happened. But rather as specifically co-organized spatial setups. For example, when this page is considered, the act of putting the size upon its whiteness is contemplated as an event, which had to be reconstructed, a mise en scène which happened to the page in a particular enclosed space. This is thought of in terms of its spatial conditions, size, light, quattrocento upright furniture supporting the writing activity, etc. You could see these examples of what the life of the scholar in the 15th century was, in terms of what was, as it were, the posture, what was the analysis of, as it were, this event of writing, and how that happened in terms of this kind of spatial setups. Thus, according to this argument, the page is that surface which, in agreeing and submitting to lattice, provides for, nourishes the fantasy of individual expression. Okay, the page is that. If I go back, you face it. Oh, okay, I'll go forward now. To think of the page as those kind of letters I put in. These are various examples of the scholars working, and again, different kind of spatial setups. Oop. These are, again, sort of examples, but more kind of medieval nature. The one on the left is from St. Mark in Venice. Okay, what I wanted to say is that the very page is that particular surface which provides and sort of nourishes in a scholar the fantasy of individual expression, what I call tout dire. I'm referring to Derrida's tout dire, when you can actually pour everything in a page, when you can say everything, when you kind of pour it all down, which can be expressed both as personal fulfillment and even a path towards innovation. The personal satisfaction of seeing it all written on the page has a twofold appeal. It relates to the imminence of the future, while it draws upon the communications with the past. The object page is thus a complex blend, recording aspirations and making them possible. A complex blend. The page is a complex blend, recording aspirations, which I think it was doing for Alberti, and making them possible. In Alberti's case, it acted as an impetus to transform the ruins and the shipwreck of letters and arts into becoming respectable, artes liberales. Okay, I'm just reminding you that before Alberti has written this treatise, painting was considered as a craft. And it's really only with something sort of being framed by the letters, put into letters, and sort of put in the realm of letters that it sort of becomes like a liberal art. So this is what the surface of the page provides. This is what it provided for Alberti. This attitude towards the surface of the page meant that a strong reliance and a sense of trust, strong reliance and a sense of trust of the surface was at stake in his case, and which I would say was to play a significant role in respect to other arts such as painting. Now, if we come then to the kind of argument about intersection that I sort of referred to earlier, I'm sort of now saying that in a way this intersection, this mysterious plane that Alberti puts in the visual pyramid, something that Brunelleschi has indeed never done, or anybody else before him, is actually the page. It's this page on which we can pour everything, write everything, on which we can, as it were, project, we would say in contemporary language, everything that we wish to. Okay, and I'm sort of bringing it now back to that argument. this intersection that Alberti has introduced is, in my understanding, this very page. What cuts the visual pyramid is the blank page, something that is a part of his, as it were, everyday life. Alberti's intersection is therefore determined as a surface which enables a particular visual aspect of the object to be noted. Above all, this surface is the one of transcription, where the form, the number, and the size, and the disposition of elements can be translated and disseminated in a universal manner. In the operation of this surface, we can see the relation, the page, to the page, which also allows for the prospect of transcription, disposition, and regulation of the elements presented. Therefore, Alberti's drive and motivation in introducing the intersecting surface could have come only from the experience of reading from and writing on the page, which has always acted, as I call it, as an epistemological screen. Historically, throughout the Middle Ages, reading and writing became, we could say, formidable practices, exceeding those of antiquity. Indeed, in antiquity, they were not such an important practices. Reading and writing, that's why I have here this kind of medieval kind of examples. Although the acts of reading and writing are commonly understood as reading marks, which are always transcended in a pursuit of meaning, what is usually forgotten, and this is my point, is the surface which bears the marks and thus spatially conditions the transcendence itself. Okay, so what is usually kind of referred to when one is reading or writing, people are reading letters. And what is usually never mentioned is that these letters are actually held by the surface. Men of letters, through the experience of reading and writing, therefore privileged the surface and its accompanied possibility of transcendence. So the reading and writing is reading and writing what the letters say, but it is this kind of transcending with the surface, if we sort of analyze it as it were as a spatial setup, if we sort of don't analyze it and don't, as it were, immediately buy into the kind of notion of reading and writing, if we sort of analyze what happens spatially when we see somebody sitting behind a desk and reading books. So it is therefore not entirely a surprise that Alberti links his invention of the intersecting vellum, which he calls in Italian, to his analysis of the outline. He says that the outline, disegno, is the most important part of a painting. Okay, that which then comes to that surface is the most important. No compositional coloring could help a badly drawn outline, he says, while a good outline itself could be pleasing. Okay, so here comes this kind of, for the history of drawing, this is an important moment, okay, because we can see how he sort of here defines what the drawing is, what disegno is. This is one of the first kind of moments when the term disegno is used in this sense. He also uses the term dintorni in Italian, or in Latin he uses the term circumscriptione. What is important here is by sort of making this kind of gentle transition from the page and the writing, the moment when in a way we start to sort of see something on this white page that cuts the visual pyramid, is the moment when we are going to see something which Alberti says is very important. And those are dintorni, that's disegno, that's the outline. And that is the moment when he sort of privileges. These are various pages by Alberti. This is one of the medieval examples of what might sort of again be related to what I referred to earlier as transparency. Whilst on the right I was trying to sort of bring an example of a drawing of Pisanello, who follows, as it were, Alberti's kind of discussion on the perspective. And in this drawing we see how, as it were, the outline gradually kind of emerges. So I'm quoting this relevant bit, and this would be the last quote, but I think it's quite interesting. From the Pictura, where Alberti kind of describes this. Let due pains, therefore, be taken about this material part, for the easy learning of which I do not think anything could be better contrived than that vellum, which among my friends I'm used to call intersection, or in Italian taglia, which sort of suggests the cutting. Its use was first invented by me, and here he says it. You know, it's kind of interesting that no scholar, no Renaissance scholar has actually ever pointed out that he actually says it here, I invented it. Its use was first invented by me, and it is as follows. I take a veil, and this is, think of Duras, how he kind of follows this description. I take a veil made of finest threads, but not closely woven. The color matters not. This I divide into what number of square I think proper by some bigger threads parallel to each other, stretching it upon a window frame, which I place between the eye and the object, that the visual pyramid, piramide visiva, may pass to it, penetrando passi, through the veil. Okay? This is the moment where he sort of explains what the intersection is, how the painters should approach it, and when he sort of says that he invented it. The fact that Brunelleschi did not take this direction to demonstrate perspective further suggests that this small step could only have been taken by a man of letters, reflecting on letters, as I explained earlier when I referred to De Commodis. Perspective in a mode of intersection did not occur to the virtuoso of spatial enterprises, which Brunelleschi was, because he chose to construct an accurate but complex three-dimensional instrument, which, if we are to fully understand it, may probably tell us more about ancient optics. Although Brunelleschi's model was skillful, it was not easy to understand, as we've seen from Manetti's. The complex description of Brunelleschi's experiments from Manetti onwards never managed to simply and elegantly present his perspectival event. Even 20th century scholarship remains in difficulty to fully reconstruct and comprehend it. I was showing earlier this Battisti's kind of attempt to do it, and indeed a lot of people have done this attempt to sort of reconstruct it and do it almost to kind of clarify it, but it always kind of something is always never quite achieved by it, and never quite put in relation to what Alberti has been saying in my argument. Painters, architects, scholars and others have always found, on the other hand, that Alberti's idea of surface cutting through the visual pyramid provided a more agreeable paradigm, which is the main reason why people never fail to understand it. For some reasons, comprehending this axiom of an intersecting surface was never very difficult. It suggests, I argue, human ability to project the visual perception onto a flat surface. However, this ability was only possible in a culture deeply rooted, determined, and saturated by the experiences of reading and writing, thus permanently transcending with the letters and the surface which holds them. Okay, so to try to bring this argument towards the conclusion, I would just point out another moment. I was sort of, at the beginning, also mocking the scientificity of Alberti's approach. The fact that this perspectiva artificialis is often kind of referred to also as a scientific perspective. Art historians even nowadays speak about Alberti as somebody who sort of puts this kind of scientific theory of perspective, and in a way from then onwards we have it. And indeed it's something that Panofsky still acknowledges as such. Now, I would say that there is a problem there, and as I sort of indicated, I sort of question that very kind of scientificity. For Panofsky, the problem of perspective was that the ancients failed to see and represent the totality of the world, Weltanschauung, okay, the kind of world view. I'm sort of quoting now something which would be the notion that Panofsky would held. Without going much into that at this point. So in a way, Panofsky, because he held this kind of view of the world as a totality, as this world, as the world as a totality, as this Weltanschauung, he was then always saying that the ancients have failed, okay, to represent it. What I'm saying is that the ancients haven't failed to, as it were, represent this kind of worldview, simply because they didn't hold it as such. So they couldn't fail. What they had is a kind of different geometry. What they had was Euclidean geometry, and they indeed, we could argue, remained quite faithful to it, which is why they never actually kind of dropped the eighth theorem as Alberti did when sort of fixing the distance and the angle for his perspective. So, in a way, what I'm saying is, I'm questioning here this very scientificity. Okay, I'm saying Euclid's model is, and Euclid's geometry is scientific, because within the context of what was considered, as it were, scientific, it obeys all its laws, it obeys all its kind of rules, and sort of respects all its theorems. And thus, what we are prohibited from is constructing a perspective like Alberti's, where, as it were, the distance and the angle would be fixed, because for ancients that was impossible. Because ancients would say that, as it were, how we see the object does not simply, the size of the object does not simply depend, as it were, on its distance, but also of an angle. To see an object, okay, in front of us would not necessarily mean that by distance we are going, as it were, to sort of immediately see it diminishing. Something could be done to an angle, by an increased angle, which might in a way almost keep the object in the same apparent size. This is something which we in a way can't almost see anymore, because the world vision, as described by Alberti, and as the one which sort of dropped this eighth theorem, in a way has been so dominant and inscribed both in Albertian and later in Cartesian kind of understanding of space, that we almost can't recover it. We almost can't sort of, as it were, use our eye in this way when we are, as it were, opening the angle of vision, opening and closing, and thus determining, as it were, the distance. Okay, so this is why this is quite difficult to explain. However, what could be said is that the method which just sort of which has chosen to sort of interpret ancient science of geometry, as in Euclid's, in the context of the 15th century perspective, and just sort of dropped one theorem because it was not kind of practicable, could hardly be called scientific. Okay, something was simply inconvenient and was dropped, and the whole scientificity with that sense, in that sense, was also dropped, and that is a problem. Now, as I say, the problem is that, in a way, it is very difficult for us, and in a way would need a whole kind of different new lecture to sort of discuss this issue, how was that sort of carried on by Descartes and the others. And indeed, it's a kind of a great problem. But indeed, what is interesting, the eighth theorem of Euclid's was dropped. The other part of Euclid's carried through, was interpreted, picked up, and carried on in the kind of Western metaphysics, in Western geometry, and so on and so forth. This one was dropped. And indeed, it was never recovered. And it's not kind of referred to, which is quite interesting as well. Now, why I'm saying that is, first of all, to sort of indicate some kind of problems with, as it were, the scientificity of it, and on the other hand, to sort of expose to some extent the conditions, the shortcomings, and the blind spots in our own very vision that we are not always able to acknowledge. So, if I'm to close the argument, I would have to say something like the following. The eighth theorem had to disappear, okay, if the play of desire, illusion, and seeing was to develop. And that was in a way what mattered in the 15th century, to develop, as it were, the painting, to develop the perspective. So, why bother about this eighth theorem? It became an obstacle to any kind of pictorial projection. It became an obstacle to any kind of what was considered a scientific perspective, and as such had to be simply kind of eliminated. The eighth theorem had to disappear if the play of desire, illusion, and seeing was to develop, as I said, through the experience of painting. Its exile from the discourse became a guarantee of the pleasures that image would then be able to conjure and bestow. The intervention by Alberti was possible not because people suddenly forgot the logic of the geometry and theories, of their geometry and theories, but because their desires and readiness to transcend in the mutual section with the plane surface coincided. The dropping of the eighth theorem was possible within the general understanding of knowledge whose consistency was measured by its accordance to the play of resemblances. Alberti's intervention did not disrupt the regularities of the practices at the time, but rather it, in that sense, intensified them. Panofsky remained with his understanding of space and the assumption that its representation should be continuous, unified, and total. He believed that perspective had successfully achieved this task, thus still confirming the enchantment of perspective. He never questioned perspective. He never sort of said, well, perhaps it's not the kind of best method, or perhaps, there are certain shortcomings. He sort of kept on celebrating it as something that was able to sort of represent the worldview, the Weltanschauung, which he held. And in doing so, he, in a way, failed to fully establish and elaborate on the condition of its status. This criticism could be further, as I said, supported by the fact that Euclid's theorem, as explained earlier, and the whole angle theory were never proved wrong. And this is important. They were never proved wrong. They were only abandoned as inconvenient. So, to conclude, and to come back to the original kind of discourse I had at the beginning. Let me see what I have here. What's going on? Okay, that's one there. I tried to go backwards. Right, now I go forward. Okay, this is Dürer's representation of St. Jerome in his study. Again, a contribution to one of these things that I was talking about earlier. But now I want to sort of conclude with something. I don't know what's going on. Forward, and this one forward. None of them are going forward. Okay, that's it. Okay, to conclude, I should say the following. In relation to the general issue of perspective, this presentation aimed to be a contribution which indicates the workings of the perspective. Indeed, in contribution to what Damisch has called for and what he quite rightly diagnosed, there is not enough discourse on perspective. In a sense, what I was saying earlier, having in mind how powerful it is, having in mind how speculative it is, the actual discourse on perspective is relatively small. And as I said, I'm sort of invoking Damisch here, and I'm sort of calling, as it were, for future work. But I'm also saying that there is this need workings, to, as it were, fully expose the workings of perspective, which in a way has sort of spread so vastly into, as it were, the world around us. Rather than perpetuating the Socrato-Platonic myth of Brunelleschi and Alberti, the attempt in this presentation was made to, as it were, phenomenologically in spatial terms, examine the assumptions about perspective. It led me to a conclusion that the central role was not only played by the lines and foreshortenings, by the points, lines, and foreshortenings, but by the then new element which passes undetected, i.e. the surface. The surface through which the object is viewed and through which image is constructed. The assumed surface velo is something we still hold, I would argue, whenever we see a photograph or a film. That's based on the fact that, in a way, the photographic camera, the photographic machine is actually based on the kind of perspective. It's been constructed on the principle of a perspective and on a principle of cut vision, of the whale cutting the visual pyramid. It is with us, whenever we draw a perspective, see a three-dimensional painting, or look at our three-dimensional computer graphics. We watch through its flatness all the time. Our view is constructed by its very flatness. All the images that we see, which have come through the camera, have been mediated through us, to us, by its very flatness. So when you are seeing these images, you are seeing the flatness of the camera by which they are mediated to you. Well, Cubism and Duchamp, and here I'm showing Duchamp étant donné, aimed at exposing and undoing the mechanics of the perspectival event. I'm sure you know the story. What you see here on the left is not a woman. What you see is a piece of rubber which is constructed over there in that little installation, and in front of which we have some bushes and branches, and at the back of it it's just a painting which works as a background, but it's all viewed, as it were, from that peeping position at the back. So what I'm saying, what is happening here, and Duchamp was aware of it and was doing it here, he was, as it were, undoing the perspective. He was showing, as it were, what perspective does, and in a way, he was sort of undoing it in this kind of very project. He was also playing with our desires and undoing our desire in relation to the object seen. So, as I said, well, étant donné aimed at exposing and undoing, and indeed it's not only étant donné and Duchamp, there are sort of other things in, you know, the whole discussion of Cubism, and there are some other very useful examples one can refer to. However, I'm just here referring to this, aimed at exposing and undoing the mechanics of the perspectival event by questioning the lines, figures, shortenings. Alberti's notional velo, or surface, was never, as it were, accounted in these early works. What I would argue is that it's been accounted in the work of another artist, and this work I would date in, as we know it, in Lucio Fontana, his work in 1959, where Fontana negotiated a query into the status of this veil, in my mind. Okay, for some of you who have seen this most recent exhibition, which was very helpful in that respect, we could see how, in a way, it is, as it were, a whole study towards arriving at the surface, at a flat white surface, and then, as it were, daring to penetrate it, daring to cut it. So, what I'm saying, while Duchamp was sort of preoccupied by showing still the mechanics of the perspective and the lines, he was not quite dealing, as it were, with the veil. The person who, as it were, in my mind, sort of exposes the veil is, as it were, Fontana in this work. And I'm not sort of going to celebrate only him. perhaps it's kind of interesting to say that he said for himself that he would like to be remembered as a painter whose only achievement was to cut this surface. Perhaps other examples should be put forward. And in that respect, on the left, what you see here is a painting by Robert Ryman from 1966, who is another painter in relation to whom we can sort of discuss perhaps this white surface, this kind of transparent and white surface at the same time. He, we could say, perhaps detects it in his work. We know that he has repeatedly exhibited this series of white, or call it transparent, transparent surfaces, they are both white and transparent, as I say, of canvases, which perhaps we could call that they somehow come to veil our vision for good. Okay, and indeed it's really to this artist that in a way we sort of owe a lot of things about the discovery of this very surface. So, I say for good because its absence in contemporary kind of workings, and indeed in School of Architecture and schools of architecture, will we constantly use perspective. And indeed, I would like to make a point that there has been in the 90s, with the development of computer technology, again a shift back towards perspective, as opposed to the 80s, when there was a lot of questioning of the perspective and a lot of experiments were done to sort of do perhaps some kind of architectural representation, drawings or otherwise, in some other means. In particular, in this school, the work of people like Don Bates and Raoul Banschurten was sort of dealing with that. You know, there was a kind of a serious kind of insistence of sort of not trusting perspective and sort of looking for other means of representation. And indeed, in the 90s, we have this kind of, again, kind of unquestioned return of the representation, which I link to the kind of development of the software and the kind of the very pleasure that we sort of have in the kind of 3D images, which now we were able to sort of again sort of establish on our screens. So there is, as it were, still a lot of work to be done and said about the kind of perspective and the ways how it is always able to sort of come in. When you think you sort of dealt with it, it comes back. So in a way, we could say that in a way it came to sort of kind of haunt us for good, because we still sort of, and this veil also came to haunt us for good, because what I said is that its absence is still kind of conceived in terms of representation as an error, while its presence, with the Cartesian legacy attached to support it, is still seen as a guarantee of the representational correctness. Indeed, how glad we are to find it in our computer screens. Stop here. Thank you. Martha.
Perhaps you did make it clear, but I'm not clear on the relationship between the veil as a device and the notion of...
The veil
as a device,
right.
And the notion of an absolute sort of space.
The absolute of the space.
Yeah, absolute of space, and...
Totality of space.
Corollary to that absolute would be the notion of measured absolute space.
Mm. Okay, I sort of jumped through the argument a bit kind of quickly towards the end. I didn't quite explain it. But this actually is based on Panofsky's celebrating perspective, okay, as something that was invented in the 15th century, which sort of, as it were, finally manages to systematically represents space. So we don't have a situation anymore, as in Pompeian paintings, when we have a bit of perspective in some of the buildings, and then we go in another part of the painting, and then we have another bit of perspective, which is kind of related, but not necessarily.
But
okay, there is a discontinuity.
My question
but suddenly,
is this coming from Alberti, or is it coming?
No, it's from Panofsky.
Added later into the argument.
No, this
and
is
therefore
Panofsky
you
who
could
sort
actually
of
think of using the veil without the absolute idea. I mean, in other words, can you think of using the veil but not having the absolute idea as well at the same time?
Right, yes, okay. Can it be the veil? Can there be the veil without the absolute idea is the question. Well, what I was referring is of course to the Panofsky, and as it were when it was fixed and celebrated as an achievement. However, there is a continuity of building towards that position. And this is why I mentioned Descartes, which I think would be another person next to be studied in relation to this, because he kind of takes the same attitude, and he believes, okay, as indeed a lot of the people in the 16th and 17th century, that in a way the representation of space in the Renaissance was kind of achieved. The only problem they had is that they were not quite good in measuring it. Okay, so the whole idea of measurement comes with the Descartes, Perrault, and the others. So in a way, there was a method there which is good and sort of in abstract kind of presents this kind of space. However, what we now have to do in the late, more like 17th century, in the late 16th, 17th century, what we now have to do is to sort of do it scientifically, correctly, to do it correctly in terms of measurements, and to sort of subject it further to mathematical laws. So in a way, Descartes' three axes, okay, which were to sort of be introduced as three axes of axonometry, or axonometric representation, are, as it were, workings upon Alberti's space, in my reading, in which the representation was there, but just needed to be put in a kind of mathematical and scientific kind of shape. And I say it's not that easy. It's a very serious subject, like how did it happen and what are the issues at Descartes, and in a way it is really a kind of a study that it needs to be undertaken, and I'm kind of looking forward to do a bit more work there. But what is undoubtedly the case is that we further have a kind of development of these geometries, because, as it were, the 18th century after Descartes picks up Descartes' understanding of space and his geometry, and in a way develops it further, hence Monge's geometry. Hence, kind of the continuation of the Monge's geometry into the 19th and 20th century, and the kind of modernist axonometrics and kind of the whole that discourse. So in a way, there is a kind of continuity that is being built up there, and you are quite right. It does need to sort of, be looked at in more details, both in terms of, as it were, reading the historical texts and the kind of theoretical account of the persons involved, and as it were, attaching exactly the arguments and how they went on. But yes, that would be my answer. But there is definitely a continuity which sort of, as we know, with the kind of Panofsky is then sort of linked into this kind of paradigm of Weltanschauung, a worldview, which now sort of bridges between the discipline and sort of links, as it were, the aspects of philosophy, mathematics, representation, and art together in this kind of very notion.
Could I kind of ask it? Well, the first really is more like a sort of comment. It seemed to me that when your argument turns to the question of the letter as somehow belonging internally to this debate about perspective, and it came up, I think, very much when you showed the Carpaccio?
Carpaccio, St. Augustine, yeah.
St. Augustine.
Slightly later than Alberti's.
It has something to do with the fact that one of the difficulties of of getting your case through in a way is that people still treat the issue of perspective as in some sense a scientific or transcendental kind of question, and therefore can't see the kind of specific links between certain things. One thing it did seem to me that links the question of the rise of perspective, architecture and the letter together is precisely the role of the city. That is to say, the development of perspective itself is a peculiarly is actually a celebration of the Republic of Letters, in the sense that sort of Plato will say that letters belong on the inside of the city wall and shouldn't go wandering off into the countryside. So, I mean, one of the things really is, and I think then of course comes up in the Duchamp, in a sense what you get is a situation where perspective is constitutively about the city and architecture, and therefore is not in the same way, it doesn't bear the same relation to what we then come to call landscape, which is precisely why, as it were, Duchamp takes the figure of the woman in landscape as one of the means of sort of deconstructing that whole figure. So that was sort of like partly suggestion. I also think that your argument goes a long way to, in a sense, justifying what otherwise is taken often to be a sort of mad remark by Lacan, that architecture is a two-dimensional practice. That is to say, you know...
Well, it was not for Brunelleschi, that would be...
Sorry?
It was not for Brunelleschi.
Well, I mean, yes and no, in the sense that the space which is both represented by perspective, but which perspective constructs, is a certain type of architectural space, which will break down at certain points. You know, in Martha, you know, you were doing that kind of thing in the summer school, precisely to attend to the moment when kind of another space erupts into and disrupts the order of perspective. So in that sense, perspective architecture is always an attempt to, you know, not just to represent, but in some sense to master a certain space. And I think that really is given very sort of careful justification in the paper.
Further to that, I suppose I'm grateful that you mentioned Don Bates and others who were questioning perspective space, who were looking for other ways to explore work in the school, because I think it's very true to claim, I agree with the claim, that if we had Bill Mitchell here from MIT, he is so fond of showing us two slides and saying, oh, by the way, this one is a photograph, I took it last week, and the other one is a 3D perspective model from a CAD software program. Oh, by the way, we did this one 2 years ago, and I did the photograph, and they're the same, which is an extravagant claim about this kind of power over reality. In other words, we have this computing power, which means we can project reality. Here it is, and the photo confirms what we claimed before. So I think the idea that we're back to a sort of literal use of perspective or an unquestioning use of perspective is present, especially because of these tools.
Yes, I wanted to actually underline it as a symptom.
So in other words, I guess my question is, in the veil of Alberti, to some extent, he must have been trying to make a claim that it was related to reality, that it was a measured representation, and therefore it had that, perhaps it had some measured relation to reality. But I suspect it wasn't this literal idea that, look, here's the reality. How did the veil, or how did Alberti's conception of perspective relate to more than just measuring a space? I mean, wasn't there actually much more of a well, how would you characterize his claims about space in the veil? Because I don't think that they would be this. You mocked his science,
yes.
So what would his claims be?
The thing about the veil is, you're actually pointing out towards a kind of good area of discussion. What is interesting, and I didn't sort of have time to sort of go through all of this, but in a way, if it could partly answer your question, is this. When Alberti sets to write this perspective, he says, I'm not going to write like a mathematical. Okay, so he does not want to be, as it were, writing solely as a man of knowledge, as a scholar. He said, I want to write as a pittore, as a painter. And that means that, in a way, something else had to be brought in, and he says it. Something else had to be brought in, which in a way is not solely a question of science and knowledge. And that, in a way, also is something that escapes a lot of kind of commentators. And this is why, in relation to Lacan, is important as well. Because what he actually says that, in a way, the world vision, and what I'm going to talk to about as a pittore, is actually dependent also on what we actually, what I would call, want to see, wish to see, and desire to see. And he does acknowledges that. Okay, he says, and what I have this as a comment. He says, can't find it in my moment. He says we have to refer to a different kind of wisdom. In a translation, it sounds like this: to a more sensate wisdom. In Italian, he says, in a più grassa Minerva, which sounds very funny because it sort of says like more fat. Minerva, yes? So in a way, we are referring to a kind of a different kind of Minerva, but what in a way it's translated by Grayson and the other is a kind of more sensate wisdom. So it's not a wisdom of scholars and knowledge, but it's a wisdom that is about senses and sensuality, and in that sense incorporates desire. So what is quite interesting here is, and this is, as I say, art historians don't kind of acknowledge that in a way the realm of desire is not left out. It's sort of included in his account of perspective. And the whole kind of realm of, we would call it nowadays unconscious desire, he calls it voluptas, is, as it were, included and sort of taken account when he says, I will speak as a pittore, when he says, I will speak as a painter. And he actually sort of makes it as a decision at the beginning, and he actually makes it as a departure, that he will actually do that. And why is that? Because he refers to the voluptas of the people at the time, and this is precisely what is the subject of the Commodus. Looking at all things that are desired by the Florentines at the time, by the people around him at the time, and mapping them down. Okay, so he said he's interested in all these things that in a way now letters which are shipwrecked and in ruins can't anymore deliver. That is to say, scholars can't anymore deliver because in a way people outside are interested in other things. Okay, so I have to, in order to sort of make letters live this new life and become, and he includes it. He sort of says that that's how he will speak, and he sort of says that that's different from some of his other writings which want to be so purely scientific. John?
Would you not say that the shipwreck was necessary in the sense that, I mean, he's very plaintive about his ship of letters, but in order to arrive at the ruin which architecture reconstructs, the shipwreck is in some sense a part of the narrative action.
That's right. The shipwreck is the condition of letters at the time. Okay, the metaphor of the shipwreck is the condition of the letters at the time. Letters which are supposed to glide, be something which sort of means achievement, because ships, navis at the time, mean achievement, adventure, going into something new, but also technological achievement. Letters which are supposed to be something like that, that is to say, taking us somewhere, are now shipwrecked. And that is a problem. And that is a kind of detected as a problem and arts are in ruins because of the shipwreck. So in a way, the two of them he sees as kind of necessarily coming together. The writing, which in a way has to be like a ship, which in a way have to pull out these arts, which in antiquity, in ancient times, kind of existed, would be the meaning, and which somehow are now kind of in a ruin. They have to be shipwrecked by writing, and when sort of one brings that kind of acknowledgement of the status of the arts as ruins, and when one sort of brings it together with a kind of his wish to write a subject that are relevant for his contemporaries, where there what he calls libido is, and indeed he refers to the kind of passion about building as a kind of libido edificandi itself. So he sort of wants to sort of bring all these things forward, but it happens in letters. And he says it has to happen in letters. And indeed, what Mark was sort of pointing out, if I may come back to that issue, the problem of showing this lecture with the slides, it's the first time I actually done it with the slides, and it's quite difficult because indeed Alberti never paints anything. So in a way, it's all bogus. I was playing a trick on you by using slides. In a way, it was unfair. Because in a way, if I were to show anything, I should have shown only, as it were, the writings, because all what happened to him was, like in these pages which I was showing in between, in this kind of letters, all these kind of decisions, consequences, theories, discussions of the Florentines, their desires and voluptas were actually happening there. So in a way, it is, but it also is an opening, that the point that you sort of have mentioned, that in a way could be a rupture and the opening in relation to Martha and Michael's unit.
One more question. I mean, the point which you didn't comment on that much, but which is extremely interesting, and you've probably done some work on it, is the kind of equivalence of pictorial or imagery representation with word representation in Alberti. What do you think has happened to that? I mean, obviously,
the equivalence.
Panofsky et al. Would not vote for that. What happened to that sort of moment in Alberti?
Equivalence between the words and images?
Yeah.
Well, this is precisely what I say, what happens in these moments of transparency. And this is a moment of a transparency. It's actually a moment when transparency is conceived as this particular kind of condition or operation where you see something and it's at the same time two things. Okay? Transparency means, in this sense, what I was using in this kind of general kind of understanding, that it is two things at the same time. Okay, it is in my, and this is what happens in this moment, what I would say, it is at the same time a transparency like the page where you read, and as it were you read the letters, you transcend the moment, where that very thing which you are reading is also something like an image. Okay, but in a way to enhance the whole thing, that is not the image only of letters, which in a way is usually acknowledged, but I'm saying it's the letters on the surface. So in a way, the transparency comes with the letters on the surface. It does not come only through letters. So in a way, once you recover the surface, okay, which is something which is always kind of forgotten, assumed, and so on and so forth. Once you recover the surface, you have, as it were, the white surface of a page upon which you can start to sort of inscribe whatever you wish it to inscribe. And that's why I was sort of bringing these manuscripts of the Pictura, which had this kind of little kind of checked ground, which was sort of suggesting the space which is to appear. And that's why I was showing this little drawing by Pisanello where some figures appear, to sort of bring it close to this moment of transparency of the page, when these two are kind of, just as it were, a flip of the moment, kind of away from each other, but when they could also be kind of seen as one and the same thing. And this, of course, refers to the moment of what I refer to as to dire, the moment which Derrida refers to in the acts of writing, which is this moment when you, as it were, let your desire go into the piece of writing to write everything you want to write, and indeed where you, in a painting, are prepared to see anything you want to see.
Text he was involved in, but do you think that he had some influence of other cultures? What I'm referring to is that the Arab culture had their paintings in a way that the page was always a part of the painting. So do you think that because of the time period that all the translations from the Arab cultures, like all the Greek translations to Arabic script, and from Arabic to other languages, do you think it's a part of that reason that the page is again came into his paintings?
I think you're raising a whole kind of interesting area of discussion, and you are absolutely right. I think there is a history which links the development of the kind of European manuscript to both Arabic and Persian tradition of manuscripts, which included imagery. Okay, and in a way that belongs, as it were, even to the kind of previous periods than Quattrocento. It sort of could be followed in kind of from the 8th, 9th century onwards. And in a way there is a point there to be sort of studied. And indeed, we know that a lot of historians would say that a lot of kind of painters of the manuscripts were sort of moving from east to the west, both from Persia and Arab countries to the Greece, and then from Greece to Venice, and so on and so forth, as kind of events were calling, depending on the events. Yes, it is an interesting, actually. I have a good example of that, which I didn't bring today, of two different presentations of the siege of the city. There is one which is a presentation of the siege of Constantinople, and one which is a presentation of the same siege, one by the kind of Greek scholar and one by the Persian scholar. And it's quite interesting to sort of compare how the very siege of the city, including the city walls, the disposition of the city, and including the cavalry and soldiers and all that, are kind of put in relation to the city, and a lot of things could be said about that. And it is all on a page of a manuscript, as it were, at the capital letter that starts it. It's all this kind of representation. Now, it's a big topic. And yes, Alberti would know about these things because he was in the libraries. Now, the question of availability of the manuscripts, we know that in a way it's quite limited, the number of manuscripts he had in his time. In a way, the manuscripts came slightly from the east. He would have more Arabic manuscripts which came from northern Africa via Spain or Sicily. Some
I think we're going to have to end that, but I think everyone looks forward to the argument kind of being developed and published. I think it's an extremely important argument because, in a way, together with obviously other people like Damish, it goes back to what is otherwise a real obstacle in the study of perspective. In something like the work of Gombrich, where he says, on the one hand, the perspective is a discovery, like a scientific discovery. On the other hand, he says, people immediately start kind of taking pleasure in it by designing buildings which kind of stress the perspectival kind of dimension. Now, the question really is, why would they? Why wouldn't they just say, well, now we know how to do representation? Why would it have any kind of effect upon the practice of architecture? You simply can't answer that question
without
if
bringing
you feel that it was just a somewhat early but nonetheless real statement of a natural law. and I think we should kind of really all welcome your account. Thank you very much indeed.